Hello, web programming students. Let's do a quick overview of UX and UI. So this is getting prepped. Sitemaps help to identify the structure of a digital product like a website or an app by showing the hierarchy and connections of content. So you started doing sitemaps with last week's assignment, and then you're going to refine them in this week's assignment. Task flows go a step further by identifying the various courses of action that a user might take. So if you've been to Wawa and used the kiosk, there are certain steps that you would go through to order a sandwich or whatever else you're getting at Wawa. So this is the same thing. You enter the site at a certain point, and then you follow through some steps to complete some kind of task. So the difference between UX and UI is that UX is user experience design. This is the internal experience that a person has as they interact with every aspect of a company's products and services. So the user experience of going to Wawa means parking or walking up to it, going inside, where you walk to first, what you see first, all of that stuff, even before you get to the kiosk to order a sandwich, that's all user experience design. And once you get to the kiosk itself, that's the user interface. That's user interface design. The series of screens, pages, and visual elements like buttons and icons that the user has to interact with a device. So on the UX side, we have things like wireframes, which we'll do this week, personas, which you started last week, and some of that other stuff. User testing we'll get into a little later, but UI you'll start this week. You'll start to design your UI kit, so buttons and other icons that you would use on your website, depending on the website you've picked. Those are the sorts of things you'll start to work on going forward. You've done some mood boards last week. You'll start to carry them through this week. UX is focused on the user's journey to solve a problem. My problem is I need a sandwich. And UI is focused on how product surfaces look and function. So if it's easy for me to add toppings to my sandwich at Wawa, then that's good. But these two things work together to complete a task. A design system is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of applications. So let's think of this as what encompasses your UI kit. So besides just the UI, there's all the other branding and other things that go along with it. Those of you who are design students should be aware of this already. But all of this put together goes into the design of a website or an app or whatever digital experience you're talking about. So here's an example of it in place. You have cards here in this particular website. There's a menu on the left with icons. And so this is how this particular website is constructed, or at least the UI kit is constructed. Now let's talk about wireframes. So some of you may recognize what this is a wireframe of. And if you don't already, this is a version of the Batmobile. Wireframing allows a designer to plan the layout and interaction of an interface without being distracted by colors, typeface choices, or even copy. So this is very bare bones, depending on how much detail you put in, but the detail does not include colors, typeface, or real copy. If a user can't figure out where to go on a black and white wireframe, it won't matter what colors you choose. So a button has to be obvious as well, even if it's not shiny or brightly colored. You should think about how different screens are and how different people are, if they're visually impaired or such. So using a wireframe, you can map these things out for maximum effect. Like the foundation of a building, it has to be fundamentally strong before you decide to give it an expensive coat of paint. Sketching makes you think and work faster. So you can work through different ways to create an interface, craft an interface, to identify which layout, content presentation, and functions work best. So here is some sketches on some graph paper with some annotations you'll see here. This is the kind of idea they have for a wireframe and a little bit of explainer text to go along with it. Here is sketches of a UI kit. So here's what a header would look like: search bar, keyboard. For an app, it looks like, or some kind of website app. You have other different elements to sketch out, to think through how things will look, the relative sizes of them. Here's some icons and such over here. Feedback and what would it look like if you make a mistake, what's the error message look like, that kind of thing. So these are things to include in your UI kit. Annotation is another important thing to go along with wireframes, because just a wireframe by itself isn't interactive. And so having a way to explain how different things work on a wireframe is helpful using these red colored annotations. Give clear explanations to your design decisions, why you have this in this location, etc. Here's some rules of thumb for annotating your wireframes. You should annotate items that are conditional. You should annotate what happens when you click links and buttons. Does it change color? Does it transition slowly? Does it move at all? That kind of thing. Anything that due to space could not be shown on a wireframe, such as like a drop-down menu that you wouldn't show on a piece of paper, or you can show it on a piece of paper, but if you can't, then it would be nice to put an annotation there. Anything with a business, logical, or technical constraint, such as the longest possible length of a password field, you may want to mark that in there because it may impact how much space you give to a certain element. Some things not to put in your annotations: rather than drawing a gray box and then having annotation that says this is where the logo is, just put the word logo in the gray box. For paragraphs of text, use lorem ipsum only when the paragraph's content is obvious. Otherwise, you might just want to put something like, this is a paragraph introducing this section, directly in the wireframe. But it depends on your content. Here's something called the 960 grid. So the nice thing about 960 is that it's divisible by many different factors of 10. And so it'll break down nicely in a 16-column grid. And so you can organize your stuff very neatly in a 960 grid. So you can get proportions all nice using this grid. Here's some more examples of wireframes. This one's a little more high fidelity. It's got some text here, no colors yet, but you have different shades of color, different shades of gray. You're starting to get a little more detail visually. Here's another wireframe with a little more color, just a little bit. And so it shows you some things. There's no real text, but to give you the appearance of text here. So there's a little slightly higher fidelity wireframe. Here's an even more higher fidelity wireframe, some actual text, real text here, real looking text here, and here. Some Greek text here, but not much. Here are some pop-ups. Pop-ups you would show on your wireframe here. If you click on this, then this shows up, that kind of situation. One thing to note is to avoid unintended connotations. So putting pictures in your wireframes may give the wrong idea. So you kind of want to keep things generic unless you really have a lockdown marketing strategy and things like that. You probably want to avoid famous people unless you're working on a famous people website. Finally, prototyping. A prototype is a simulation of the interaction between a user and interface. We won't get into it right now, but you can use things like InVision or Figma or XD or Balsamic to make interactive prototypes. And so depending on your client, you may want to use an interactive prototype instead of paper wireframes. So it depends on how they work, what they want to see, how they interact with a design itself. But these prototypes experience the content and interactions. They test the main interactions similar to the final product. And even though they might not look exactly the same, they should be pretty close. So that's a quick overview of UX and UI. I'll give you some more resources that you can explore on your own as you go through your stage 2 work for this week.